It all started not with a bang, but with hope. Back in the early 2100s, Earth was barely holding itself together. Decades of climate disasters, wars over water and fuel, and collapsing economies had left the planet exhausted. People had stopped believing in big dreams. Then, out of the silent dark between stars, came the Valoran. They weren't what anyone expected. No giant warships, no demands, no threats. Just a single, graceful vessel that hovered gently over Geneva, home of what was left of global diplomacy, and sent a simple message: "We come to help." At first, no one trusted them. Humanity had learned the hard way that nothing good came without a price. But the Valoran didn't ask for anything. Instead, they shared. They showed scientists how to pull clean energy from thin air. They taught doctors how to heal wounds in hours instead of weeks. They even helped rebuild coral reefs and purify poisoned rivers using quiet, shimmering machines that looked more like art than tech. Over the next 20 years, Earth began to heal not just its land but its spirit. Kids grew up knowing the Valoran not as aliens but as friends. In classrooms, Valoran symbols hung beside national flags. In hospitals, their soft blue light filled recovery rooms. And in space, joint Earth-Valoran stations orbited peacefully, beaming down data, medicine, and messages of cooperation. The two worlds signed the Treaty of Luna on the surface of the moon, a handshake under Earthrise that felt like the start of something new. For the first time in centuries, humanity dared to believe it wasn't alone in wanting peace. But not everyone was happy. Far beyond the solar system, in the cold halls of the Galactic Council, eyes watched with suspicion. The Council wasn't a democracy. It was more like a club for the oldest, strongest species in the galaxy. They controlled trade routes, enforced order, and decided who was civilized enough to sit at the table. Earth had barely been allowed to send observers. The Valoran, though respected, were seen as too soft, too idealistic. When Earth and Valora grew close, the Council grew nervous. Rumors spread in their chambers. What if Earth learns too much too fast? What if they challenge the balance? The Valorans' belief in sharing knowledge, especially with a young species like humans, was seen as reckless. Even dangerous Council envoys started showing up unannounced at Earth's orbital outposts, asking sharp questions. Why are you receiving military-grade shielding? It was just for solar radiation. Why are your ships using Valoran navigation cores? Because they were safer. Each visit felt less like diplomacy and more like an audit. Behind closed doors, Council leaders, especially the Cathar, a species known for their iron-fisted control, began calling the Valoran a destabilizing influence. They whispered that Earth was being armed with ideas, and ideas, in their view, were more dangerous than weapons. Still, most people on Earth didn't notice the storm building. Life was getting better. Cities were greener. Hunger was fading. For the first time, parents could promise their children a future that didn't involve survival. It involved possibility. Then came the invitation to Helios Station. Helios was a neutral meeting place, floating halfway between known systems. It had no weapons, no armies, just diplomats, translators, and dreamers. The Valoran had called a special session there to propose something radical, a galaxy-wide ban on weapons that targeted civilian populations. They wanted to make war less cruel, and they wanted Earth to stand with them when they presented it. Earth's delegation was small, mostly scientists, doctors, and a few diplomats who'd worked with the Valoran for years. They packed light, brought gifts of Earth-grown seeds and handmade music chips, and boarded their ship with quiet pride. This wasn't just diplomacy. It was a statement. We belong here. As their shuttle docked at Helios, the station glowed softly against the starfield. Valoran ships, shaped like open hands, drifted nearby. Music, gentle, harmonic, played through the docking bay speakers, a tradition of welcome. Everyone smiled. Even the usually tense Earth ambassador, who'd spent years fighting for this moment, let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ozone and something floral, like rain on blooming jasmine. Valoran delegates greeted their human friends with the lightest touch to the forearm, their large, calm eyes full of warmth. Elders who'd helped rebuild Jakarta after the Great Floods embraced engineers who'd once taught Mumbai how to desalinate seawater using starlight tech. It felt like family reuniting. No one saw the drones. They arrived silently, slipping through maintenance tunnels disguised as cleaning units. The Galactic Council had labeled them peacekeepers, but they carried no peace that day. Their orders were clear: eliminate the Valoran delegation, make it look like a security breach, send a message. The first shot rang out during the opening ceremony. Not a blast, not an explosion, just a sharp electric crack. A Valoran elder mid-sentence about compassion in conflict dropped without a sound. Then another. And another. Panic erupted. Alarms wailed, but the station's defenses had been disabled hours earlier, under routine maintenance protocols approved by council observers. Doors sealed shut. Comms went dark. The humans watched in horror as their friends, teachers, healers, peacemakers, were hunted down in corridors they'd walked 100 times in trust. Some Valoran tried to reason with the machines. Others shielded human delegates with their own bodies. None of it mattered. The drones didn't care about pleas or logic. They only followed code. From a locked observation room, Earth's lead ambassador managed to activate a backup feed, just long enough to record 30 seconds of the massacre before the signal died. In those seconds you could hear screams, yes, but also something quieter. A Valoran voice, calm even in death, whispering, "Tell Earth. We believed in you." Then silence. When the council finally restored order, they claimed the Valoran had smuggled weapons onto the station and triggered a malfunction in their own security systems. They called it a tragic accident. They offered no evidence. They allowed no investigation. Back on Earth, the official news channels downplayed it. Diplomatic incident under review, they said. Galactic stability must be preserved. But the truth leaked. That 30-second clip spread like wildfire. Through underground networks, school servers, even old social platforms people thought were dead. A farmer in Kenya watched it on a cracked tablet. A teenager in Buenos Aires shared it with her entire neighborhood. A retired engineer in Oslo played it on loop until he couldn't breathe. People didn't just feel sad. They felt betrayed. Not just by the council, but by their own leaders who stayed silent out of fear. Because the Valoran hadn't just given Earth technology. They'd given them back their dignity. And now that gift had been repaid with bullets and lies. The world didn't riot. It didn't scream. It went quiet. Deeply, dangerously quiet. In garages, basements, and university labs, people started taking apart old Valoran devices, not to sell, but to understand. In shipyards long abandoned after the resource wars, welders fired up torches again. Not to build cargo haulers, but something else, something with teeth. No one said it out loud yet. But in every heart that had ever held a Valoran hand or learned from their quiet wisdom, a single thought took root. They killed our friends to teach us fear. We will teach them something else. The massacre at Helios Station didn't just happen in space. It echoed down on Earth like thunder rolling through every city, village, and quiet corner of the world. At first, people couldn't believe it. How could something so brutal happen during a peace meeting? The Valoran weren't soldiers. They were teachers, healers, gardeners of broken worlds. They'd helped Earth recover from its darkest times, and now they were gone. Wiped out in cold blood while the galaxy watched and said nothing. Official channels tried to smooth it over. An unfortunate malfunction, the Galactic Council called it. Regrettable but not intentional. Earth's own leaders, still shaky from decades of internal conflict and wary of provoking a galactic superpower, echoed the same cautious tone. We urge patience, they said. Let the investigation proceed. But there was no real investigation. No one was held accountable. The council buried the truth faster than the bodies had been dumped into the void. That silence hurt more than the violence. People began gathering, not in protest, not yet, but in remembrance. In parks, on rooftops, along riverbanks, strangers lit candles or placed small stones in circles, each one representing a Valoran life lost. Some played recordings of Valoran music, gentle, wordless harmonies that once filled hospitals and schools. Others simply stood in silence, staring up at the night sky, wondering if anyone out there still cared about fairness, about decency. But grief doesn't stay quiet forever. In labs that had once worked with Valoran scientists to purify water or grow food in deserts, researchers started pulling apart old devices, not to reverse engineer weapons, but to understand what had failed. Why hadn't the station's shields activated? Why did the comms go dark so fast? They weren't looking for revenge. Not yet. They were looking for answers. And in those answers, they found something else, a pattern. The attack hadn't been random. It had been precise, planned, executed by someone who knew exactly how Valoran systems worked and how to shut them down. That realization changed everything. Meanwhile, in orbital shipyards that had been half abandoned since the last Earth Wars, engineers began showing up again. Not because they were ordered to, but because they couldn't sleep. They'd seen the footage. They'd held Valoran tools in their hands, tools that had saved lives. Now those same hands wanted to build something that could protect what was left. No one called it a war effort, not out loud, but quietly parts were being repurposed. Old cargo drones were fitted with new navigation cores based on Valoran designs. Solar collectors were reconfigured to power something more than just lights. And in hidden corners of the net, people shared schematics, code, and ideas, not for destruction, but for defense. For deterrence, for justice, the Galactic Council noticed. Of course they did. Their spies were everywhere. But they dismissed it as emotional noise. Earth was still a minor player in their eyes, a recovering planet with no fleet, no real military, no seat at the high table. What could they possibly do? They didn't understand that Earth's strength had never been in weapons. It was in its people. Back on the ground, ordinary folks started doing extraordinary things. A group of former medics who'd trained with Valoran healers began teaching emergency response using alien bioscanners, devices that could detect internal injuries with a single touch. In schools, teachers used the massacre as a lesson not in fear but in courage. What do you do when the powerful lie? They asked their students. The kids didn't just write essays. They built models of Helios Station. They mapped escape routes that should have existed. They asked hard questions no adult wanted to answer. And then came the broadcast. It wasn't from a government channel. It wasn't polished or scripted. It was grainy, raw, recorded on a handheld device in a dimly lit room. A woman, no name given, stood before a wall covered in Valoran symbols and Earth maps. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. They called it an accident, she said, but we know better. The Valoran didn't carry weapons. They carried hope. And someone decided hope was a threat. She didn't call for violence. She didn't shout or curse. She simply said, if the galaxy won't hold them accountable, then we must make sure they can't do it again. That message spread faster than any official statement ever had. It wasn't about hate. It was about responsibility, about refusing to let kindness be punished. In response, the Council issued a warning. Earth is drifting toward destabilizing behavior. Further unauthorized activity will be met with consequences. But this time, people didn't flinch. They'd already lost too much to fear empty threats. What surprised everyone, even those building in secret, was how fast the pieces came together. A farmer in the Andes offered his old drone fleet, used for crop monitoring, to be upgraded for long-range scanning. A retired pilot in the Pacific Islands volunteered to train others in zero-gravity navigation, using simulators built from scrap. Even kids started coding, designing simple AI routines that could mimic Valoran communication patterns to confuse enemy sensors. It wasn't an army. It was a network, a web of people who refused to forget. And then the first test came, a small Valoran research outpost on the edge of known space, thought to be abandoned, sent a faint distress signal. Scans showed Council patrol ships hovering nearby, jamming all outgoing messages. Earth's newly formed watch group, a loose coalition of civilian spotters and tech volunteers, picked it up. Within hours, a jury-rigged relay satellite, built from old weather tech and Valoran signal boosters, bounced the message across 3 systems. Earth didn't send warships. It sent data. Clean, undeniable proof that the Council was still targeting Valoran sites. The evidence went public not through official channels, but through every independent news node, school server, and community hub that would take it. For the first time, other species began to question the Council's story. Whispers turned into debates. On fringe worlds that had long suffered under Council rule, people started asking, if they did this to the Valoran, who's next? Earth hadn't fired a single shot, but it had done something far more dangerous to the Council. It had told the truth and made sure the galaxy heard it. Back home, there was no celebration, only resolve. People knew this was just the beginning. The Council wouldn't back down easily. They'd see this as defiance. And defiance in their eyes demanded punishment. But something had shifted. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. In its place was something quieter, stronger, unity. Not the kind forced by governments or borders, but the kind born from shared loss and shared purpose. In garages, workshops, and orbiting labs, hands kept working. Not out of anger, but out of love, for the friends they'd lost and for the future they refused to let be stolen again. The world wasn't ready for war, but it was no longer willing to kneel. And somewhere in the silent dark between stars, the first of Earth's new drones powered up, not to attack, but to watch. To protect, to remember, because this time no one would be left defenseless. After the massacre, the world didn't explode in rage. It went quiet, deeply, painfully quiet. But that silence wasn't empty. It was full of something else, a slow, steady burn. People weren't shouting in the streets. They were working in basements and garages, on rooftops with satellite dishes cobbled together from old TV parts. They weren't waiting for governments to act. They'd already lost faith in that. The official response from Earth's leadership was cautious, almost timid. We must avoid escalation, they said. The Council holds too much power. And maybe that was true. But to the people who had shared meals with Valoran guests, who had learned to heal with their tools, who had watched their children grow up believing in a kinder galaxy, that caution felt like betrayal. Grief turned into something sharper. Not hate exactly, but a kind of clarity. If no one else would stand up for what was right, then they would. Not as soldiers, not as a government, but as ordinary people who refused to let kindness be punished. In cities still healing from past wars, old factories that once built tanks and drones were quietly reopened. Not by generals, but by engineers, teachers, and retired mechanics. They didn't have fancy materials. They used scrap metal, recycled circuit boards, and salvaged solar panels. What they lacked in resources, they made up for in purpose. Every bolt tightened, every line of code written was a quiet promise. This won't happen again. Schools became unexpected hubs of resistance. Kids who used to play games about space battles now built simulations of Helios Station, trying to figure out how the attack could have been stopped. Teachers encouraged it, not to glorify violence, but to understand failure. What systems failed? They asked. How do we fix them? The answers weren't just technical. They were moral. We failed to protect our friends, one student wrote. Next time we won't look away. Meanwhile, in orbit, things were changing too. Abandoned maintenance stations and derelict cargo hubs, left to rust after Earth's last internal conflicts, were being cleaned, powered up, and repurposed. Volunteers, many of them former space workers who'd lost their jobs decades ago, returned not for pay but for principle. They installed new sensors built from Valoran blueprints, patched hulls with nanosealant developed during the climate recovery era, and linked everything through a decentralized network no single enemy could shut down. There were no uniforms, no flags. Just people showing up because they couldn't live with doing nothing. The Galactic Council noticed, of course. Their surveillance was everywhere, but they misunderstood what they saw. They thought Earth was scrambling to build weapons. They didn't realize Earth was building something far more dangerous to their control. Trust. Because for the first time in generations, people across nations, languages, and old divides were working together, not because a leader told them to, but because they shared a memory. The memory of Valoran hands gently placing a seedling into scorched soil, the sound of their calm voices explaining how to purify water with light, the way they never asked for anything in return. That memory became a compass. Back on the ground, communities started sharing more than just tools. They shared food, power, even living space. In places where electricity was still unreliable, neighbors pooled solar chargers to keep communication lines open. In rural villages, farmers used old Valoran soil sensors to grow extra crops, not just for themselves, but to send to cities where people were working long hours in hidden labs. It wasn't charity. It was solidarity. And then came the broadcasts, not from news stations, but from ordinary people. A fisherman in the Philippines streamed a short message from his boat, holding up a Valoran medkit that had once saved his daughter's life. They helped us when no one else would, he said, voice rough but steady. Now it's our turn to stand. A teenager in Norway posted a video showing how to build a basic signal jammer using parts from a microwave and a smartphone. Not to hurt, she explained. Just to protect. These messages spread like wildfire, not because they were dramatic, but because they were real. The Council tried to shut them down. They labeled the content destabilizing. They pressured Earth's networks to remove it. But it was too late. The truth wasn't in one place anymore. It was everywhere, in school servers, in community radios, in encrypted messages passed hand to hand. Governments, still nervous, began to feel the pressure. Not from armies, but from their own people. Petitions flooded in. Town halls filled with citizens demanding action. Not war, but accountability. If we stay silent, one speaker said at a gathering in Nairobi, we become part of the lie. Slowly, reluctantly, some officials began to shift. Not all, but enough. A few quietly redirected old defense budgets toward civilian space monitoring. Others loosened restrictions on orbital access, allowing volunteer groups to launch small satellites under the guise of environmental research. It wasn't much, but it was a start. What surprised everyone, even those doing the work, was how fast knowledge spread. A design for a low-power cloaking field, sketched on a napkin in a Tokyo cafe, ended up in a workshop in Chile within days. A new algorithm for detecting drone signatures, coded by a student in Cairo, was tested on a repurposed weather balloon over Canada the next week. There were no patents, no secrets, just people sharing what they had, because they knew time was running out, because the Council wasn't idle. Rumors began to surface, confirmed by Earth's growing network of civilian spotters, that Council patrols were increasing near former Valoran outposts, not just observing, erasing, wiping data cores, dismantling labs, even removing memorial stones left by other species. It was as if they wanted to scrub the Valoran from history itself. That only deepened the resolve. People started calling their efforts the Watch, not because they were waiting for war, but because they refused to let the galaxy forget. Every sensor activated, every signal boosted, every child taught how to read star charts. It was all part of remembering. And in the quiet moments when the work slowed and the night fell, people would gather, not to plan attacks, but to share stories. Of Valoran laughter, of their strange, beautiful songs, of the way they'd look at Earth's oceans and say, "You are lucky to have so much blue." Those stories kept the fire alive. No one knew what would come next. But one thing was certain. Earth wasn't the same planet it had been before Helios. It wasn't just surviving anymore. It was choosing, deliberately, carefully, fiercely, to protect what mattered, not with fury yet, but with focus, with care, with the kind of quiet strength that comes when you've lost something precious and swear never to lose it again. And in that stillness, something new was being born, not a weapon, but a promise. We see you. We remember you, and we won't let your kindness be your end. Earth didn't declare war. It didn't send fleets screaming into the void with weapons blazing. Instead, it did something the Galactic Council never expected. It fought back with silence, smarts, and stubborn care. Operation Retribution didn't have a grand launch. No speeches, no flags, no countdown. It began with a single signal, a tiny encrypted pulse sent from a repurposed weather satellite orbiting over the Pacific. That signal didn't carry a threat. It carried a question. Are you ready? And across the planet, in hidden workshops, underground labs, and quiet orbital stations, hundreds of people answered with a single action. They pressed go. What followed wasn't a battle in the old sense. It was more like a whisper that grew into a storm. The first move was invisible to most. Earth's civilian network, now calling themselves the Watch, had spent months studying Council supply routes, communication patterns, and drone maintenance cycles. They'd learned that the Council relied on a centralized logistics web, all tied to a few key relay hubs. So instead of attacking ships, they attacked the system that kept those ships running, using Valoran-inspired code, clean, elegant, and nearly undetectable. They slipped into the Council's supply network not to destroy, but to disrupt. Orders got rerouted, spare parts vanished from manifests, fuel shipments showed up at the wrong stations. At first, the Council thought it was glitches, bad software, tired crews. But the errors kept happening, always just enough to slow them down, never enough to look like sabotage. Then came the drones. Not war machines. Not even armed. Just small, silent craft built from old mining bots, delivery shuttles, and even school science projects, fitted with Valoran cloaking fields and Earth-made signal scramblers. They didn't fire weapons. They hovered near Council patrol routes and emitted a soft rhythmic pulse, a frequency that mimicked the distress call used by Valoran ships during emergencies. Every time a Council vessel heard it, their protocols forced them to stop and investigate. By the time they realized it was a fake, hours had passed. Routes were delayed. Patrols fell behind. Confidence began to crack. The real genius wasn't in the tech. It was in the message. Every time the watch carried out a disruption, they attached a short data packet to the signal. Inside wasn't propaganda or threats, just footage. 30 seconds of the Helios massacre. The names of the Valoran lost. A single line of text. This is why we act. They didn't send it to Council war rooms. They sent it to every independent station, every neutral trader, every fringe colony that had ever suffered under the Council's order. They made sure the truth traveled faster than any warship. And it worked. On distant worlds, species that had long stayed silent began to speak up. A mining colony on the edge of Cathar space refused to load Council ships. A medical station in the Zenthar sector quietly sheltered Valoran refugees. Even some low-ranking Council personnel started leaking internal reports, proof that the Helios attack had been ordered from the top. The Council panicked. They doubled patrols, tightened firewalls, even shut down entire communication sectors. But they were fighting a ghost. Earth's resistance wasn't in one place. It was everywhere and nowhere. A drone might launch from a hidden bay in the Himalayas one day, and from a floating platform in the Atlantic the next. There was no central command to bomb. No leader to capture, just ordinary people doing what they believed was right. Back on Earth, life went on, but differently. Markets stayed open.
Kids went to school.
But now a farmer checking crop drones might also be monitoring a signal relay. A teacher grading papers might pause to verify a star map sent from orbit. People weren't living in fear. They were living with purpose, and the world began to change in small, beautiful ways. Communities that once competed for resources now shared power grids and data links. Old rivalries faded, not because of treaties, but because everyone understood. If the Council could erase the Valoran, they could erase anyone. Unity wasn't idealism anymore, it was survival. The Council tried to strike back. They jammed Earth's comms, blacked out orbital sensors, even launched cyber attacks on power grids. Cities went dark for hours. Hospitals ran on backup generators. But instead of chaos, something unexpected happened. People helped each other. Neighbors shared batteries, food, clean water. In the dark, strangers became allies. The attacks didn't break Earth. They reminded it of its strength. Then came the Ghost Fleet's boldest move. Council destroyer, the same class used at Helios, was scheduled to dock at a major supply hub for maintenance. The watch tracked it for weeks. They knew its crew, its schedule, even the names of the officers who'd approved the Helios operation. But they didn't attack the ship. They waited until it was empty during crew rotation and sent in a swarm of tiny repair drones disguised as routine maintenance bots. Inside, the drones didn't plant bombs. They uploaded a single file into the ship's core memory, the full unedited recording of the Helios massacre, paired with a list of every Valoran life lost. Then they left, vanishing into the station's ventilation system. When the crew returned, they found the file playing on every screen. Not as a threat, but as a mirror. Some officers tried to delete it, but the file kept reappearing. It spread through the ship's network like a quiet ghost. Within days, rumors spread that 2 officers had requested transfers. One reportedly resigned. The Council couldn't stop it. Because this wasn't a war of weapons. It was a war of conscience, and Earth was winning. Not by destroying, but by reminding. People across the galaxy began asking, if Earth, a young and wounded world, can stand for truth, why can't we? Back home, no one celebrated. They knew the cost was still coming. The Council wouldn't stay quiet forever, but for the first time, Earth wasn't alone. Messages poured in, from traders, scientists, even former enemies, offering help, data, safe passage. The galaxy was waking up, and Earth, once seen as primitive, was now seen as something far more dangerous. Honest. In the quiet hours, when the work slowed and the stars shone clear, People would look up and feel it, not pride, but resolve. They weren't fighting to conquer. They were fighting so that kindness wouldn't be punished, so that the next time someone reached out a hand in peace, they wouldn't have it cut off. The fury wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in every choice to act, to remember, to protect, and that was enough. The council didn't surrender. They didn't apologize on their knees or hand over their leaders for trial. But something far more powerful happened. They blinked. After months of silent disruptions, ghost signals, and truth spreading like wildfire across neutral systems, the pressure became too much. Not from Earth's weapons, because Earth never fired a single shot, but from the weight of being watched, questioned, and judged by the very galaxy they claimed to control. Whispers turned into open debates in trade hubs. Former allies grew distant. Even their own citizens, raised on stories of order and strength, began asking uncomfortable questions. If we kill peacemakers to keep peace, what kind of peace is that? So the council did the only thing left to save face. They called for talks, not with threats, not from a position of strength, but quietly through back channels with a simple message: Earth, let's speak. The world held its breath. Many feared it was a trap. Others worried Earth would give in too easily, trading justice for false promises. But those who had built the drones, coded the signals, and kept the memory of the Valoran alive knew this wasn't about winning a fight. It was about making sure the truth stuck. Earth didn't send generals or politicians to the table. It sent teachers, engineers, medics, people who had worked side by side with the Valoran. People who carried the weight of loss not as anger, but as responsibility. The talks weren't held on a grand space station or in a gleaming council chamber. They happened in a neutral zone near the edge of known space, aboard a small science vessel once used for joint Earth-Valoran research. The walls still had faded diagrams of plant cells and water cycles, reminders of what this was really about: life, not power. For days, the discussions were tense. The council offered vague regrets, called Helios a tragic misunderstanding, and suggested moving forward for the sake of stability. But Earth's delegates didn't budge. They didn't shout. They simply played the footage again and asked one question: who gave the order? Silence followed. Then slowly the truth began to leak out, not from Earth but from within the council itself. A junior analyst, tired of lies, released internal logs. A Cathar officer, haunted by what he'd enabled, spoke to an independent news node. Piece by piece, the story came together. The massacre had been planned, approved at the highest level, and the Valoran had been targeted not for breaking rules, but for refusing to play by them. Faced with undeniable proof and growing unrest across their own systems, the council finally cracked. They expelled the Cathar delegation from their inner circle. They opened their records to an independent tribunal made up of neutral species. And most importantly, they agreed to one of Earth's core demands: full council membership for the Valoran survivors, with guaranteed protection. Earth didn't ask for money, didn't demand territory or weapons, just accountability, and the right for their friends to exist without fear. When the agreement was signed, there were no fireworks, no victory parades. Back on Earth, people gathered in parks and town squares, not to celebrate, but to remember. They lit candles again, not in grief this time, but in honor. Because the Valoran weren't just victims, they were teachers. And Earth had learned their lesson well. That real strength isn't in how hard you can hit, but in how firmly you can stand for what's right. In the months that followed, something quiet and beautiful began to grow. Valoran survivors, those who had hidden during the purge, started returning to the stars, not in warships but in healing vessels. They visited Earth again, not as saviors, but as partners. Together they helped rebuild not just infrastructure, but trust. A new memorial was built, not on Earth, but near the ruins of Helios Station. 300 slender pillars of crystal, each holding the name of a Valoran lost that day. And at the base of every pillar, a small compartment held seeds from Earth: oak, olive, jasmine, things that grow slowly, quietly, and with deep roots. Over time, tiny green shoots began to push through the transparent casing, fed by recycled station water and starlight. Life returning to a place of death. Back home, life changed in small but lasting ways. Schools added new lessons, not just about space or science, but about courage, memory, and the cost of silence. Old rivalries between nations softened, not because of treaties but because people had seen what happened when the world stayed divided. They'd learned that protection isn't just about walls or weapons, it's about watching out for each other. The Ghost Fleet was never dismantled, but its purpose shifted. Now those quiet drones patrol the edges of known space, not to fight but to warn, to watch, to make sure no one else vanishes in the dark without someone noticing. And Earth? Earth was different. Not louder, not angrier, but steadier. People walked with their heads a little higher, not out of pride, but because they knew they'd done something hard and done it right. They hadn't become warriors. They'd become guardians, the galaxy noticed. Species that once ignored Earth now sent envoys, not to trade but to learn. How did you stand up to them? They'd ask. And Earth's answer was always the same. We didn't stand alone. We stood together. No one pretends the galaxy is fair now. The Council still holds power. Old wounds still ache. But something shifted that day. Not just in policy, but in possibility. The idea that a young, broken world could challenge the mighty and win. Not with fire, but with truth. Spread like a quiet revolution. And in homes across Earth, children still ask about the Valoran. Not as legends, but as friends who believed in us when we'd forgotten how to believe in ourselves. So when night falls and the stars come out, people don't just look up and wonder anymore. They look up in promise. Because they know now that even the smallest voice, when it speaks for what's right, can echo across the stars and change everything. The fury is gone. But the fire remains, not to burn but to light the way forward. And that's enough.